afternoon, everyone. My name is Gregg Roman, the Executive Director of the Middle East Forum, and thank you for joining us for today's special briefing on the situation in Iran. Islamic Republic faces its most existential crisis in 46 years. As of January 5th, Iran is entering the 9th consecutive day of nationwide protests that began on December 28th in Tehran's Grand Bazaar. Unlike previous uprisings focused on social reforms, protesters are now explicitly calling for the end of the Islamic Republic itself, chanting "Death to Khamenei" and "We don't want the Islamic Republic." The uprising has spread to 222 locations across 78 cities in 26 provinces, with death tolls, depending on reports, ranging from 16 to 31 and between 500 and 1,100 arrests. We'll have more accurate numbers after we have our panel this afternoon. Israeli intelligence reports that Khamenei has even potentially prepared an escape plan to Moscow with his surviving 20 family members. Iranian officials privately described the government as being in, quote, survival mode. For the first time since 1979, Iranians aren't protesting for reform. They're demanding the complete dismantling of the Islamic Republic. The bizarre shutdown that triggered this uprising carries profound historical significance. Bazaar strikes are what brought down the Shah in 1979. Now those same merchants responsible for removing Pahlavi have turned against the mullahs. At the Middle East Forum, we've long argued that the only lasting solution to the Iran problem doesn't lie in nuclear deals or diplomatic band-aids, but in supporting the Iranian people's aspirations for freedom. Our Iran Freedom Project has been working to empower Iranian civil society and ensure dissidents have the tools they need, particularly digital communications, to organize and resist. The regime's playbook has always relied on information blackouts. Every time protests erupt, Tehran cuts the internet to isolate dissidents and prevent coordination. That's why we forcefully advocated for alternative means for those in Iran who hope to get their message out, that have video of the protests, to be able to coordinate with the Iranian diaspora, to have solutions that are core components in any serious Iran strategy. Digital freedom is just as powerful as economic sanctions. A connected Iran is a free Iran. President Trump's warning to Iran that America is locked and loaded if the regime kills peaceful protesters sends an important message. Effective intervention encompasses a broad spectrum of options: diplomatic pressure, economic sanctions, cyber operations, and targeted strikes to disrupt Iranian regime capabilities. The focus must remain squarely on empowering the Iranian people, who have shown remarkable courage in confronting a brutal security apparatus. We may be standing at an inflection point where 46 years of tyranny finally ends. Today's briefing brings together our Iran experts to analyze what's happening, what to look for, and most importantly, what should come next. I'm joined by Michael Rubin, MEF's Director of Policy Analysis, also by Daniel Pipes, the founder of the Middle East Forum, Jonathan Spire, our Director of Research, reporting from Jerusalem, Mardo Sagam, Senior Analyst and Writer for the MEF Observer, Shai Khatiri, Vice President of Development at the Yorktown Institute and a Fellow at MEF contributor, and Ben Baird, the Director of MEF Action on The View from Washington. We'll get started with Michael. Michael, you have a unique background, having lived in post-revolution Iran. You've been writing about this, commissioning pieces on the MEF Observer. You even had an article that you put out a few days ago, "The Fall of Iran Could Change Everything," warning that regime collapse could trigger civil war and millions of refugees. What's your take on this situation from day one of the protests until today, and where is it going?
Well, look, it's clear that the Iranian people want change. At the same time, we can surmise from the past that the Iranian regime, which is an ideological regime, is going to do everything in its power to prevent that. I mean, for the last 46 years, it's always been a battle between the Iranian opposition and those who want freedom, seeking to fan the embers that exist while the regime tries to smother them. What's interesting now, however, is that the regime seems increasingly to have difficulty on its own smothering these embers. And this is why, and there's been lots of discussion about whether the Iranians are relying on foreign mercenaries simply because the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps itself won't fire on the crowds in the street. Now, this is actually an important issue. We have in American political discourse, oftentimes we talk about hardliners versus reformers in Iranian politics. Fine. but we don't talk about the factional divisions within the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. It's not monolithic. And what we need to be looking for is signs that that Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is starting to fracture. No, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps formed by under Ayatollah Khomeini because he didn't trust the army. When Ayatollah Khomeini led the Islamic Revolution back in 1979, he thought that the Iranian army were fence sitters who only went with the wind. Now the question will be whether the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is sitting on the fence and what it will take in order to push it off the fence. The last point I would make, Greg, is to point out with a note of sobriety that there are often zombie regimes which lose popular legitimacy, but that doesn't mean that they themselves fall. They can persist. Just look at North Korea, for example. However, one thing I would look at from the pattern of history is when the regime does fall, there's going to be a mad scramble for the capital, Tehran, and that leaves open a lot of uncertainty in the periphery. What differs now between the now and the past is that there are any number of actors in neighboring states that might try to exacerbate the situation to ensure that any transition isn't going to be smooth. This is where I think we very much need to worry. One last cautionary note. The United States often likes to talk about an even playing field. The problem is, if everyone else has their thumbs on the scale, but the United States professes and engages in neutrality and takes a hands-off approach, what that means is that the forces which are most beneficial to the U.S. vision of what Iran should be in the future are the most disadvantaged because they're the only ones who don't seem to be able to tap support.
Michael, just as a follow-up really quick, in one of your pieces, you spoke about the regime's survival calculus. You've warned that a collapse of the regime could mean civil war and millions of refugees. Can you walk us through a disorderly collapse versus a controlled implosion or a managed transition? And specifically, what should Washington be preparing for?
Okay. The thing to understand, Greg, is that the supreme leader has a network of businesses worth $100 billion. At the same time, the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps is more a conglomerate than it is simply a military. If you want to understand the role of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps in Iran today, imagine taking Bechtel, KBR, Halliburton, merging it with Northrop Grumman and Boeing, ExxonMobil and Chevron, and throw Walmart in as well, and then add the Army Corps of Engineers. That's what the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps' economic wing is. Now, if you have a fall of the regime now, or just a fall of Khamenei, you're going to have the first transition in 35 years. It's going to be a mad scramble for those resources. It's also important, and Shea has written about this before, that when Ayatollah Khamenei became the supreme leader, he was a compromise candidate because people thought he was weak and malleable. But he managed to consolidate control. And he did that by imprisoning opponents and sometimes by killing opponents. And so you have a mindset in the leadership circles that if they don't survive, that they may end up on the wrong ends of the gallows. So you're going to have a mad scramble of some who simply want to try to win the lottery, a $200 billion lottery. You have others who are going to do what they need to survive, and that suggests that there will be a mad scramble. Now, if you're the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, you're not going to subordinate yourself to anyone who is going to threaten your interests. Now, the last point to make, Greg, here is that when you have a situation like this, you have this mad scramble, but you could also have a possibility in which the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps decides enough with the clerics. Let Ali Khamenei go to Moscow and do what he wants to do, play video games with Bashar al-Assad, that the Revolutionary Guard is going to take over. This is where things get curious. We, too often Americans, project. We want to imagine that others have the same values that we do. We want to look at multiculturalism as being able to walk into a sushi restaurant and order a mojito. But fundamentally, we've got to understand that different peoples can think in fundamentally different ways. So you could have an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps dictatorship. Then the question becomes whether it's going to be just a military dictatorship like Abdel Fattah al-Sisi in Egypt, or whether the people that have joined the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps are true ideologues, true believers. You can go into the Revolutionary Guard circles when you're 8 years old, join the equivalent of evil Boy Scouts, and you can be indoctrinated into this ideology. If you have an Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, which is ideological, throws out the clerics, but still wants to kill Jews, still wants to eradicate the state of Israel, where does that leave things? Then there's the broader question of, if you have the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps try to seize control, who's going to counter them? Now, also, and I'm sorry for rabbiting on too long, Greg, just one quick point.
I want to get to that point, though, which is about the Iranian people and those who are ideologues that believe in the regime, the IRGC, the institutions of power, and really what prompted this moment. So, Michael, I'll give you 15 seconds to close your thoughts, but I want to move to Mardo to speak about what's going on.
Yeah. Okay, so what I would worry about now, in 2007, the Revolutionary Guard put one unit in every province, and they have caches of arms. There's going to be a mad scramble to contain those caches of arms. That's what we saw in Libya. That's what we're going to see in Iran. I'd like to see the contingency planning to prevent regional warlords from raiding arms depots and establishing themselves as regional forces or fighting each other for control of Tehran.
Thank you, Michael. Mardo Sogam, you spent 3 decades at Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty overseeing the Iran and Afghanistan service. But before that, you are from Iran originally. You've also been speaking with friends, colleagues, those who are in the country now. And having covered Iran for the past 3 decades, you've written that this is the first time that protesters are explicitly calling for the end of the Islamic Republic, not just reforms. What shifted in the Iranian public's mindset? What makes this protest different from all other protests?
The Israeli attack last June really demonstrated clearly the impotence of the Islamic Republic. And that gave courage to majority of Iranians who reject this regime. The second thing is that economic hardships became much worse than 6 months ago. It got to a point that really the people find themselves at a dead end. I mean, people who were middle class even 2 years ago, today cannot afford meat. There have been tidbits on social media showing that security forces, individuals, not as a collective, individuals are finding themselves in the same economic abyss that ordinary Iranians find themselves. I mean, security forces, IRGC, might have a little bit higher salaries, but the devaluation of the rial has been so bad that now even well-paid IRGC personnel find themselves unable to make ends meet. And this is a big psychological letdown for them, huge.
I'm going to turn over to Daniel Pipes for a second, who joins us from Washington, D.C. Daniel, the chairman of the Middle East Forum, the organization's founder and former president, has covered this country for more than 40 years, both as a policymaker, as an academic, as a commentator. And Daniel, you've made the argument that taking down the Iranian regime would knock out the head of the Hydra and accelerate the global decline of Islamism. If this uprising succeeds, how fundamentally would the Middle East as a region change?
Well, I think it would be an enormous change. It was the Islamic Revolution of 1978-79 that created the modern Middle East, the Middle East of the near past 50 years, and the demise of the Islamic Republic would be the end of that era. It is enormously consequential. I'd also note that while there have been many major revolutions in modern history, think of France, 1789, Russian Revolution, 1917, Chinese Revolution, 1949. I would argue that it was the Iranian Revolution of 1978-79 that was, in fact, the ultimate revolution. It was not a bunch of conspirators. It was not a few cliques in the capital. It was a nationwide uprising. And it appears that the Iranians have been practicing, have been rehearsing for a counter-revolution that is as large as the one of nearly 50 years ago. Over time, each of the uprisings, for example, in 2009 and then 2022, and now in 2025-6, is larger. More towns, more people, more elements of the population are getting engaged. And in particular, I'd point to the Bazaris, the people of the Bazaar, who for over a century have been critical to the key moments in Iranian history. The tobacco insurrection of 1892, constitutional crisis of 1905, oil issue of 1952, the Islamic Revolution of 1978. In each case, it was the Bazaris who had a critical role. And for the first time since 1978-79, the Bazaris are now engaged. The Bazaris have closed down. And that, to me, suggests that something very different is taking place from the previous efforts to overthrow the regime.
Now, you've been quoted in the past as saying, better anarchy than Khamenei. Critics worry about regional chaos if the regime collapses. Why do you believe the risks of inaction outweigh the risks of regime change?
Well, for people on the ground in Iran, anarchy might well be worse than despotism. At least you know the rules. When there's despotism and anarchy, there aren't rules. But for we on the outside, I think anarchy is preferable to despotism. For example, in Iraq, better the mess since 2003 than Saddam Hussein's tyranny before that. And I think likewise here, it is likely to be a mess. And in particular, something that Michael alluded to, which is that the provinces are full of agitation. The Kurds, the Baluchis, the Laz, the Azeris. There are so many people in the Persian Empire of Iran who are restive and who want out, or at least a fundamental change, that could lead to years, decades of trouble. But from my point of view, certainly that's preferable to this totalitarian regime that has created such misery for its own people and for the region.
Shay, I want to bring you in for a second. You've written about IRGC troops becoming disillusioned and taking second jobs because the regime can't pay them. How deep do the fractures go? At what point might security forces refuse orders to fire on protesters?
I think refusing orders is an interesting question. They might already be refusing that. That's one. And the second scenario is that every protest that we've had since 2017, extent that the the extent of violence regime forces have used against the people has declined. In 2019, they had to bring in foreign proxies to do the crackdown. And I think part of it is that some might be refusing orders, and a bigger problem is that the regime might not be giving the order, not trusting that they would execute even. It is also worth noting about the factional divisions that Michael brought up. There was a leaked document, a memorandum of conversation between IRGC commanders and Khamenei from 2022 protests that came out in 2023. So the memorandum is from late 2022. IRGC commanders are meeting with Khamenei and telling them the state of their forces. There's a clear ideological divide, and the through line is those in charge of strategic commands like Khatam al-Anbiya base or the missile base or the Quds force are all hardliners saying just kill as many protesters as necessary to defend the regime. And the base commanders who are more, closer to the people or overseeing conscripts are among the people, living among the people, living in smaller cities and towns. They're all sympathetic with the people and with the demands. And a big part of it is that their own forces are, even the commissioned officers are still junior officers who have family members, average citizens, and understand the struggles and relay them to their commanders. One, and two, they were not getting paid enough themselves. And the crisis at the point, and the conversation ends with Khamenei saying that we will ensure that the financial needs of your troops will be taken care of. And I believe a month after that happened, Biden administration released $6 billion of Iranian frozen assets, and that is 10 to 20% of Iranian budget at the time. These problems persist, that commanders who are not really that important to the regime's foreign policy and are just there in case there's an invasion to fight and cause an insurgency possibly or a conventional defense.
Shay, I want to ask you, just moving on
Of course.
away from the IRGC a little bit. You have observed these 17 years of a series of protests since 2009 with the Green Movement all the way to today. I asked this question, and I want to ask you too, from being part of a younger generation. What makes these protests different from those in 2022, 2019, 2009? Why is this a different protest?
If you allow me, let me start with 2009 quickly because I was on the ground at the time. And the protest began with "Where is my vote?" and ended to "Death to the dictator." The problem was when the regime broke its own promise of restricted elections. And that's when it became "Death to the dictator." I think 17 actually is when the protest became about regime change, not recently. And at the time, you have Rouhani, you have JCPOA, every problem that the regime had said, every excuse regime had run out. That is the hardliners, it's the sanctions, etc., etc. And also the new generation was just much more secular than the previous generation. Difference this time is the Israeli success, as Mardo mentioned. Sunnia from the Atlantic Council tweeted recently that she had been going through the eliminated personnel during the 12-day war. A third of people in charge of crackdown in 2022 have been eliminated. There is a significant boost of morale among the protesters. And the other difference is the Islamic Republic had three pillars of legitimacy: Islam, economic populism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Zionism. So you start with Islam, and beginning in 1990s, Iranians begin to resist Islamism. Hijabs keep going back. The women's overdresses keep becoming opener and opener. And girlfriends and boyfriends appear in public. Up to a point now that Mohammad Tahari, a very conservative MP, I kid you not, said it's okay if women do not wear hijab in public, at least have the courtesy not to show your belly buttons.
No, so that gives you an idea of how the cultural mores have evolved, maybe from the way that they were prior to the revolution. They come back, become more conservative, and now they're becoming more secular. Now, I do want to bring in Ben Baird, who is the director of MEF Action. We've been giving you all this analysis, but Ben, people who are watching this recording, can actually act to help the protesters at home. You've led campaigns on Iran. There's legislation in Congress that they can support. There's even organizations they can reach out to. You've written that Congress can crush Iran's regime without firing a shot through legislation like the Maximum Support Act. What specific bills need to pass, and what would they accomplish?
Right. Well, I think what we're seeing in Iran right now is that sanctions work, right? We're seeing that this is a very economic-based protest movement going on across the country. It started with merchants, and a lot of that can be attributed to the fact that U.S. sanctions over time have worked, and they've been supplemented with military action. I think the last non-ideological large-scale protests in 2019, these were also due to rising oil prices, energy prices that resulted from sanctions. And it's hard to believe, but there are still many different ways to sanction this regime. They are bypassing a lot of the sanctions that the U.S. has put on it by going through China and selling oil, gas, and energy to China. So applying some secondary sanctions on China for helping them bypass sanctions is a great first step. But there's a number of things we've done at the Middle East Forum. We launched a maximum pressure campaign series back in June, July during the 12 Days War, where we wanted to take congressional legislation that was on the table and allow our supporters to write to their Congress members and ask them to push this legislation. These are things like the Maximum Pressure Act, which is a very robust, complex piece of legislation that includes new sanctions against Iran's supreme leader, IRG officials, entities that are aiding in the production of ballistic missiles and drones. It targets new sectors like metals, construction, mining. Again, there are still new ways that we can sanction this regime and put more pressure on it. It also enforces a nuclear and missile crackdown. There's no sanctions relief on Iran until it can verify it dismantles its nuclear and biological programs.
How can our listeners urge their members of Congress to support this legislation?
They can go to our website, meforum.org, and they can go to our action tab. And if you visit our action tab, you'll see some of our maximum pressure campaigns there on our website. And you can participate simply by signing up. It'll identify your elected officials, and you can tell them to support the Maximum Pressure and Maximum Support Act in Congress.
And this means that they can talk to their congressman, they can put out social media, they can find letters, correct? They have many different options that are available through that platform.
Absolutely. They can send letters to their elected officials. They can send out tweets that are automatically set up. And very importantly, they can even set up district meetings with their elected officials to talk about this legislation. And we're happy to help facilitate that.
Thank you, Ben. And if anybody is visiting Washington, I know you're a pretty jovial, outgoing guy. If they want to have coffee with you can just write you an email, right?
Absolutely. Please email me. My last name, Baird, BAIRD, at meforum.org. I'd be happy to meet with you and discuss these issues at any time.
Yeah, I do want to get to Margo on an audience question. We have a lot of questions that were asked here that I think are important to answer. But Margo, one of the questions from Steve Gilbert, they asked about 15 minutes ago was, Iran is a little bit more than half Persian, but there's all these different sectarian groups, ethnic groups, different religions inside of the country, different local and regional interests. How is this playing out amongst Iran's minorities?
In terms of opposition to the regime, the distinctions are not too much in terms of less support or more support for the protests. I think everybody is almost equally tired of the Islamic Republic. They see no future. And outlying areas, border regions, provinces with no oil production or heavy industry actually suffer more. They are more impoverished and equally desperate for change. In terms of minorities confronting one another in this chaotic revolutionary environment, I think it's more outsiders' exaggerated perceptions of things. I don't think regional or ethnic groups, linguistic groups are kind of posed against one another at all. Their number one enemy they perceive to be the Islamic Republic. However, some small political groups representing this or that ethnic minority might be a different story because their establishment and history goes back to the Middle East's leftist history, leftist movements. So they have an ideological investment in even being anti-Israeli, certainly being pro-China, pro-Russia, this type of. But these are the leadership of small groups, not the people they say they represent. What I wanted to say, one more interesting note I had to mention is that an eyewitness 4 days ago told us, Middle East Forum, that she went around Tehran, walked around the streets. One thing she saw is that security forces are tired, were tired. One of them commented to her that, I just want to sit down. I have been standing for 32 hours. This is one thing. The other notable thing is that the fearsome special units just number 60,000 troops, the special units, in a country 5 times the size of France, just 60,000. So if 100 locations start protests together, there is no way you can have enough troops allocated to all these locations. You would have 600 troops per location if you are talking about 100 locations. The important thing is that in Tehran, the protests are happening in neighborhoods, pockets of protests. The critical moment is if the people can join together, not even 1 million, let's say 400, 500,000 people, can kind of all these streams come to the center of the city, join together. The target being national radio television, the target being Khamenei's headquarters, which is in the center of Tehran.
And Shay, you're hearing from protesters on the ground on a day in, day out basis. You're not just observing what's going on Telegram and Twitter. What are the protesters asking the West to do to support them?
A lot of protesters are asking for decapitation, but I think Jonathan is correct. If, in fact, my advice would be kill everyone around Khamenei. Keep Khamenei alive, because if you want an orderly transition, you want Khamenei to surrender authority to someone to legitimate the incoming interim president or whatever that might be. We want Khamenei to feel defenseless, to be able to be forced to give up power to someone else. Now, as for protesters, a big task they have is, again, targeted assassinations. Another one is internet. They are really worried about their capability to communicate with each other. And a big debate they are having right now is what would be the prospects of a military intervention, because last time that Israel attacked Iran, the problem was nobody came to the street because Israel asked people to evacuate to Iran. And how would you manage some sort of intervention and limited intervention without scaring people out of streets? And that is a debate that Iranians are having among themselves. But I think after military action, the biggest one is do not give this regime any money, number one. Number two, give us free internet so we can communicate and coordinate.
So we're going to get Daniel Pipes on here in a second. Really quick question to Mardo. What's the Crown Prince Reza Pahlavi's role in this entire uprising?
Yes, this is something we did not mention. To be fair, one big difference between these protests and previous protests is that overwhelmingly the protesters are calling for the restoration of constitutional monarchy. Very clearly, unequivocally, they are calling for restoration of monarchy. That is, of course, one reason is the memory they have from the orderly government they had before the 1979 revolution. And of course, the credit goes to the Pahlavi family, which modernized Iran and in 50 years made Iran from a medieval country into the Middle East's most progressive country, most developed country. Oil helped, but others had oil and they squandered everything, like Iraq. So this is one thing. So they support him. They want him back. They think that he is a patriot. Now, here, this is the important thing. Ordinary Iranians have given up the illusion that Islamic Republic officials are minimally patriotic. They don't believe that. They believe that they are Islamists. For them, the Islamic Ummah is an excuse to steal money from the government, the people's money. So they have no credibility in terms of patriots. What Reza Pahlavi has, on the other hand, based on the credit that his father and grandfather amassed, he's a patriot. They don't think he's out there to get them, to rob them.
Maura, thank you. Daniel, I want to look at this beyond just what's going on in Iran, but to step into the shoes of the Qataris, the Turks, maybe even look at this from the eyes of the Russians and the Chinese. What do these four powers have to gain or lose from a successful revolution or counter-revolution in Iran?
While there are tensions between Turkey and Iran, certainly between Qatar and Iran, they all premise their international policies on the existence of the Islamic Republic. Should it transfer from their general alliance to an American alliance, to the American side, or even neutrality, this is a real problem. It's a problem for the Russians, who need the technology and actual weapons coming from Iran. It's a problem from the Chinese, who depend to a certain extent on Iranian energy supplies. It's a problem for Turkey, which, although there is a real rivalry that goes back half a millennium, derives strength from the fact that it is one of a group of Islamist governments. Same goes for Qatar. So it's a disaster. It is the flip side, in short, of the disaster that 1979 was for the United States, when Iran went from being a foremost American ally to being a foremost American enemy.
Ben, you're a veteran of the war on terror, Afghanistan, Iraq. You've been deployed overseas. And Barbara Rambowitz says here that the revolution is not always revolutionary. Look at how 20 years of Western nation building, aka de-radicalization in Afghanistan, turned out. Just from your experience being a non-Iraqi, non-Afghani, having served overseas, Ben, what's the appetite in Washington for regime change right now? And is there any role for the U.S. military in that?
Well, up until last week, maybe before actions in Venezuela, I would have thought there was minimal appetite for that in Iran, but it turns out that the administration does seem willing to use force and even intervene to change a regime. We all learned that. And so it's
What does that "Make Iran Great Again" hat on Truth Social mean in your context? Is Trump trying to tell us something?
right. I think that's a populist message saying that we can get involved here. We're willing to get involved to some extent, whether or not that's kinetic or that's doing things like providing humanitarian aid, dropping supplies to protesters. We'll see how far the administration is willing to go to take out the regime.
Now, a lot of President Trump's own members of this party said that he ran on a platform of making America great again and America first, which in their mind means non-interventionism, no more endless wars. How does this juxtaposition between what he has done in the past week with Venezuela, what he's threatening to do to Iran, mesh with, let's say, his base? And frankly, we haven't spoken about this so much, but what's the Democratic reaction to everything going on with the protests?
Right. I think Democrats have always had a somewhat hands-off approach to what is happening in Iran and wouldn't want us to get involved there. I think President Trump's non-interventionist base was really surprised by what's happened in Venezuela. With Iran, Trump has always been a bit more willing to take the gloves off, as we saw during his first administration with strikes to take out Soleimani and, very strict sanctions that were enforced. And I think that had things escalated during the 12 days war, we would have saw even more taking out troops inside of, or militias inside of Iraq. May have been action that the administration took. But it's been a great surprise, regardless of what Trump did before. I think all bets are on right now. Who knows how he's going to act? And I think that's in the administration's favor. They want the regime to not know how they're going to respond here.
So there's been this idea, Shay, that there's this fissure between the Iranian army and the Revolutionary Guards. Can you go into that for about 60 seconds and extrapolate what that might mean for a post-revolutionary Iran, the army take over control and interim measures? How would that play out?
So I have actually never seen any evidence for such fissure. And people in the intelligence community I have talked to said we gave up trying to reach out to the Artesh in the 1990s, early 2000s, because they were more pro-regime because of these accusations. They were so worried. If there is going to be any defection, it's going to come from IRGC. I don't think that the Artesh is going to be a player here one way or another. I think that's the short answer.
We're saying the Artesh, you mean the Iranian regular army?
A nationalist military, yes.
Okay. Ardo, do you have a different take on that in terms of some of the other security forces beyond the IRGC? Let's say
I absolutely agree with what Shai says. And I think that their commanders are wholly IRGC. They don't have their own separate commanders. So you're talking about conscripts. They are nobody, nothing, and probably not even armed in many instances. So the one thing I am worried about is it seems that in Venezuela, the Trump administration wants to keep a part of the Maduro regime in place to keep law and order, whatever. In Iran, that won't work. I'm not sure if it will work in Venezuela, but in Iran, issue is not simply taking Khamenei out. The issue is much more fundamental and serious. And I hope that the Trump administration doesn't think that there is a painless and easy way for regime change in Iran by taking one person out and hoping a better guy will replace him. That's not going to work. A better guy will not replace him. The better guy might put up a better face for 6 months, but he will quickly revert to his anti-West, the system's anti-West, anti-Israeli stance.
So the IRGC loses their ability to have power in the country, and you have remnants of the IRGC. I'm going to maybe throw this over to Ben. What's the possibility of a Shia ISIS?
I think that, the Iranian populace is more diverse than that. I think that the nature of these protests suggests that you're not going to have some big ideological jihadist force come and replace. But I do think that the IRGC taking out a senior leader, there's always going to be the IRGC there, as was stated that it's a massive conglomerate with many economic interests throughout the country. And so that means that, taking cutting off the head of the viper is not going to make the IRGC go away overnight. It is much more complex than this. There are many leading officials that would have to be taken out and the right people put in power.
I want to give the last question to Daniel Pipes. And I want to ask Daniel to sort of step into the shoes of Marco Rubio, the Secretary of State. And President Trump is asking you for options. What should be the U.S. policy? What argument do you make to the president in favor of intervening, if any at all?
Well, the United States government should support the opposition to the Islamic Republic. It is an out-and-out enemy of the United States. The United States government should not do this itself. We should not be in the business of regime change. We should support those Iranians who seek regime change. We should provide money. We should provide platforms to get their message out. We should provide arms, but we should not do it ourselves. This is something for the Iranians to do. And the same, by the way, applies to Venezuela and more broadly. We are not in the business, we should not be in the business of changing regimes. That, I think, is an iron rule that must always be followed. And there are plenty of Iranians who do not like this regime. The trouble is the Iranians are very divided, and it'll be very politically difficult to decide whom to support with what kind of support. And it'll get extremely complex. But the general principle that we support the opponents of hostile regimes, as for example what we did in the Soviet bloc, should stand.
Thank you, Daniel. And I want to thank our panelists today. Michael Rubin, Director of Policy Analysis, Jonathan Spire, Director of Research, Daniel Pipes, MEF Chairman, Benjamin Baird, MEF Action Director, Kateri, Vice President of Development at the Yorktown Institute and Fellow at MEF, and Marta Sagam. Frankly, Marta, we got to make you a fellow now. I mean, you've been on at least 2 of these podcasts, so I think you're qualifying now. And just some closing thoughts. And also, thank you to our producer for putting together this event so quickly and the rest of MEF's staff. My closing thoughts. First, this moment is different. We've seen Iranian protests before, 2009, 2017, 2019, 2022. Each time, the regime survived through brute force and information blackouts. But today, Iranians aren't asking for reform. They're demanding an end to the Islamic regime itself. The Bazaar merchants that brought down the Shah have turned on the mullahs. Protesters are marching in Qom, the regime's spiritual heartland. And Khamenei, by all accounts, has a plane waiting. Second, America has a choice. We can stand on the sidelines and watch history unfold, or we can actively support the Iranian people's aspirations for freedom. It doesn't mean boots on the ground. It means ensuring that Iranians can communicate, organize, and coordinate despite regime blackouts. It means maximum economic pressure that squeezes the regime's ability to pay its security forces. And it means passing legislation like the Maximum Support Act that prioritizes internet freedom tools and digital connectivity. A connected Iran is a free Iran. Third, whatever comes next, we need to be ready. Regime change in Iran would be the most consequential geopolitical shift since the fall of the Soviet Union. It would defang Hezbollah, strand the Houthis, and eliminate the Middle East's primary engine of terror and instability. But transitions can be chaotic. That's why the Middle East Forum is already thinking about truth and reconciliation, about how to trace the billions the regime has stolen, and about what a free Iran might look like. The Iranian people have shown extraordinary courage. They're facing live ammunition with nothing but their voices and their phones. The least we can do is to make sure that Washington is paying attention and be prepared to act. Thank you all for joining us. Please visit meforum.org to follow our continuing coverage and to support our Iran Freedom Project. The end of the Islamic Republic may finally be within reach. Have a good afternoon.